Well, you're tuned in to the Zelos podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder. This week, I've got Jonah Rosner on. He is one of the youngest sports science coordinators for the NFL, in this case, for the Houston Texans. And before that, well, he was with Austin FC, the Major League Soccer club that just got established a few years ago. We're going to find out all about sports science with Major League Soccer and the NFL, and heck, we'll even throw in some artificial intelligence while we're at it. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rocky_Snyder. Click that subscribe button, and away we go. Well, it's really interesting with my next guest, Jonah Rosner, who has been working with the Houston Texans organization, but at such, I gotta say, a young age, mid-20s, fresh out of college, universities, and so on. Jonah, first, welcome to Zelos, but I would love to know, how did you get your door in the NFL with the Texans, and what was that like? What was your journey there?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I want to say thank you for inviting me on the podcast today. I've been a listener for quite a while, so you've had some really esteemed guests who have definitely had an influence on my philosophy. So I'm fortunate to be joining them today. And yeah, that question about getting to the NFL at such an early age is definitely one I've been asked a lot over these past few seasons. And honestly, I think the biggest thing it comes down to, like a lot of us, is probably being in the right place at the right time. And there's some elements of luck there. I would probably be ignorant to not admit that. But yeah, so I was always super into sports growing up. My mom was actually a dietitian, so she's the one who kind of got me into the whole like wellness, exercise. She was always really big into working out. So like most of us, a failed high school athlete who kind of found the weight room to see if I can get any competitive advantage I could, which probably for me only had minimal effects because there's a genetic limitation. But I remember the first time I stepped in there, I fell in love, and I started to really fall in love with the science of it. So I went to college to Boston University, and it's very common where I'm from. So I'm originally from Fairfield, Connecticut, to do like a business degree. So I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I didn't even know like straight thinking conditioning existed, probably like a lot of people my age. And so I just did a degree in like an economics track with finance. So was fortunate enough to learn some mathematical skills and financial skills that obviously like were beneficial for me later going into sports science. But about halfway through, kind of realized I wasn't too passionate about that, and was able to do a few internships in strength and conditioning and really fell in love with it. So then I also was able to get a degree in economics and physiology. And then from there, I was fortunate enough to get an opportunity at UT Austin in Texas, where I was a graduate assistant with the basketball team. And I was able to pursue my master's degree at the same time, which was a super fortunate experience. So I was under Andrea Hootie there, was able to learn a ton, was pretty much my first experience in like a big sporting environment, obviously a Power 5 men's college basketball, which was a great opportunity. And I was just by coincidence, found myself under a very famous exercise physiologist and Dr. Ed Coyle as my graduate advisor, who also taught me a lot from like a metabolic standpoint, which piqued my interest in that. And yeah, so obviously like most of us, my life stopped when COVID hit. And then I was looking for my next opportunity, kind of wanted to stay in Austin at the time. And again, just based on coincidence and probably some luck, Austin FC, the first professional soccer team, was starting up in Austin. And Dave Tenney was the director of high performance, obviously like a very well-known figure and probably one of the best in the industry, I could say, after spending some time with him. So just randomly reached out to him, and they were kind of looking for like an intern type position to help manage the tech while also like doing some sports science. And it's kind of where I knew I wanted to go at that point. So I was fortunate to be able to do that while I was finishing up my master's degree. So I spent a year there, and yeah, I can't say enough good things about that year at Austin. Where just being around some of these very established practitioners like Dave Tenney, Chad, who's the director of fitness and rehab there, Aki, and yeah, I mean, that year was probably the biggest jump I made in regards to like my exponential growth, not only from a sports science standpoint, but just working in a high performance team and seeing how Dave interacted with everyone and how he manages people and the communication of information. And so I was able to spend some great time there. And then at the end of that year, there was an opportunity that came up with the Texans for a sports science coordinator. And I knew I was young. So at that time I was 24, about to be 25. And I had a mutual connection there because the director of sports science was Matt Van Dyke, who had spent some time at UT Austin with the football team. And we had a mutual connection, and they put me in touch, and they were looking for someone who had the ability to do some coding, which I was fortunate enough to have some experience with from my undergraduate degree and teach myself a bit more over time, but also the applied like strength and conditioning side, which I gathered some experience in too from my internships and other opportunities. And yeah, Matt and I just really hit it off. And yeah, I just worked out from there. And like I said, a lot of it was probably just a lot of my opportunities were very different and very eclectic. And I think that made a big impact of me being fortunate enough to be around some top-notch practitioners at a young age that I kind of just fell into, and they led me to the Texans.
That's fabulous. I mean, really, and it's not all luck. Obviously, you've worked hard and you've studied hard and you continue to learn and have that passion. It's obvious just by listening to your words. But I'm curious, Jonah, what were the sports that you grew up playing? Where did you
Yeah.
kind of lean toward?
Yeah, so I was a huge basketball player growing up. I played basketball and soccer throughout high school, but basketball is always my sport. That's kind of like where all my friends came from, and that's probably why originally I pursued the UT Austin opportunity, because I think when I was younger, I kind of had a dream to work in professional basketball or college basketball or the NBA, and obviously things changed over time. But yeah, big basketball fan.
Okay, and if you were to go to the NBA as a sports scientist or otherwise other positions, and being in Connecticut, I just got to ask: would it be the Nets? Would it be the Knicks? Or would it be the Celtics?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm actually about to move to Brooklyn, or I technically have a place in Brooklyn, and I'm making the slow move. I'm taking advantage of my parents' house all I can. But so I think I'm gonna have to go with the Nets for now. Been fortunate enough to talk to some of the guys there before, and I think they do a great job. But also, I gotta, I think, stay loyal to my new hometown now.
All right. Well, how about we go to soccer first? Because I was
Yeah,
wondering if you grew up playing soccer, then you know some of the finer points and the strategies. But
yeah,
a lot of people will jump in to a position on a team and they may not be quite familiar with the sport itself. But that sounds like
yeah,
it melded well for you in that position with
yeah,
Austin FC. What was that like to be in a startup and on a startup team where everything is
yeah,
forming, coaching staff, players,
yeah.
everybody kind of coming together and some working with each other for the very first time?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, that was a super unique opportunity that
Yeah.
probably most of us are never going to get, to be there when a sports franchise actually starts, and nonetheless be around like someone who's been established from a high performance director to see how he's organizing his performance department from the ground up. So that was fascinating for me in regards to see how meticulous Dave was in regards to choosing a team. He not only knew had the skill set, but he knew it would work well together and had previous experience. And I think, like you alluded to, there's a very big technical side in soccer that has melded its way into sports science. And I think that was the first time I was really exposed to this idea that we could get a lot of these stimuluses that we're looking for from a sports science standpoint or strength and conditioning standpoint within the sport itself. So just how careful they were with the drills they were doing and how involved Dave was in practice from like this technical tactical model was really fascinating for me, just because it was the first time I had been exposed to that idea that sports science had influence not only in the strength and conditioning, but also on the field in regards to how we're practicing, the stimuluses we're trying to get to practice, and how you could be so effective and so efficient if you're able to marry all those different elements together. And seeing his relationship with the coaching staff and all the people throughout the building who could be influenced by sports science, that was huge for me, just to understand how critical those relationships were and how you communicate information to those different key stakeholders.
And then, so the things that you started to learn or attach yourself to with Austin FC, what were the things that you took over to the Texans, if any? Like, did you carry
Yeah.
some of
Oh,
that over?
yeah. I would probably be naive not to say like most of my learnings from Austin FC have had the biggest influence on me. I think that's the main ones that I've kind of already talked about, have been like maintaining relationships with different key stakeholders and understanding what information is relevant to different people. A lot of it was about like presenting information. Like we had an unbelievable data scientist there, Corey Jazz, who was doing a lot of like the presenting, building dashboards. So I was able to help with some of that coding. So my coding skill set got a lot better from being around him and working with the different sports science information sources. We have a lot of that data. So I would say the big ones were definitely improving from a coding standpoint, but also just being able to communicate with different personalities and different people and presenting information to them. And that was huge for me over this past year and a half with the Texans.
And tell me a little bit more about your time with the Texans. I know you're on to other ventures, other adventures, really. But with the
Yeah.
time that you spent with the Texans themselves, what was your role as sports
Yep.
science coordinator? And then let's just kind of unpack that if you don't mind.
Yeah. So I was the sports science coordinator. So like I mentioned earlier, I was under Matt Van Dyke, who was the director of sports science there. So obviously NFL sports performance structures are very large, much larger than anything I've been exposed to before. So we had a strength and conditioning department. Most teams will have a sports science department now. I would say in the NFL, you have nutrition, wellness, obviously a medical staff with athletic trainers and everything. So my role was Matt has more of like a strength and conditioning background than mine, which is obviously like I have a strength and conditioning background too, but also some coding and a lot of statistics and data science. So Matt was given the green light to hire someone who would be able to provide some more insights in regards to maybe some of the raw data sources or can work on some other standalone projects that they thought would be important or could help some key decisions from not only like a return to play standpoint, but also just sports performance in general. So a lot of it was managing like our catapult data, so GPS data, force plate data, we do different kinds of testing on the force plate. We have they were using Nord boards there, some isometric testing. We did a lot of stuff with the 1080 split later on. So all those different sources of information, my job was kind of just to help administer that stuff, whether it just be the actual hardware, but then also collect the data and analyze it to provide some valuable insights to different stakeholders and without the organization.
Okay, I see you like Tony Stark in his VR laboratory where he's taking something and putting it there, and then he takes a
Yeah,
few things and throws it in the trash can and
yeah,
reconfiguring all this data. So, how true is that kind of image? Like, how many things were you pulling from wearable tech and force plate tech
yeah,
and all these other things and saying,
yeah,
okay, these are the big buckets we really need to look at. This is a lot of background noise that I don't have time for, and I don't even know really
yeah.
what to do with this. Like, is that kind of what you were doing?
Yeah. I mean, I think that goes into almost like a deeper philosophical question in regards to sports science becoming inundated with a lot of information sources now. And are we even applying that information in the right way and getting the most out of it? And I would say there's this trend where people think that information we're getting from sports science tech is synonymous with truth. And I'd probably argue that there's a lot of there's a big gap from A to B in regards to just collecting the information and actually applying it in a way that's like validated, responsible, and actually going to create impact. So yeah, I think the Tony Stark comparison is probably fair. It might be the glasses too, but a lot of it was trying to sift through these different sources of information we had, and first of all, making sure like the tests we were running were actually valid, that we were going to be able to run repeatable tests, that we were testing in the same environment every time. And then seeing one information wasn't just noise, because a lot of this tech, you do get some elements of noise, and what actually could help drive a decision, because we thought that information actually related to some element of performance that we can measure and track over time. And that's much easier said than done.
Yeah. So if you could select the big buckets of data collection, one maybe being sleep quality or activity level, another one being vertical force production in their lifts with a force plate, perhaps, or acceleration, deceleration with GPS, or what are the big buckets in regards to the Texans? What were the things that you were really looking at?
Yeah, honestly, I think towards the end, I'm probably biased, but I think what we were getting the most value out of, and everyone there may not agree, was actually the 1080 sprint, which is like a linear position transducer sprint machine, which you can do different testing on. A lot of it is like they can wear a belt around them and do a straight yard, 20-yard sprint or something along those lines. You get split times, velocities, some power outputs, and you can do change of direction testing on there. And the big reason we started getting a lot of value out of that was because of the practitioners around me. So about halfway through that time, Ryan Grubbs was hired to our team as like our applied biomechanist coordinator. And he has a huge background as applied sprint training and has really become more popular at a lot of the stuff he's doing recently. And honestly, being around him for like the 8 months I was around him was honestly the most I've ever learned about. Like I thought I knew about strength and conditioning and applying some of this stuff, but after being around Ryan, I realized I actually knew very little. relative to what you could possibly do. So he's extremely knowledgeable, not only in typical strength and conditioning, but sprint training, and try and connect that to the weight room. So very good from a kinematic standpoint about proper sprint kinematics, how to coach that, what cues to use. And so he came in with this framework where we were able to take a lot of the 1080 data, look at a guy's individual split time and say, hey, maybe this guy does really well early in the run. Maybe he does well later in the run from a max velocity standpoint, and then combine it with some kinematics for some video to say, hey, this is his strategy for actually producing what we're seeing here on the field. And I think the reason that became so powerful to me was because it was the closest thing we could do to the sport, especially for like some of these skill guys, like some of these really fast wide receivers or running backs, who we know like a big part of their job is to probably run fast, and they have to have really good change of direction ability, really good deceleration ability. So it almost started as like a pyramid where we would see the output on the field, and the 1080 split maybe was the closest test we can do in a closed environment that had some relevant information, and collating some of that stuff to actual like change of direction ability, and then kind of working your way down to saying, hey, how do we actually connect this to the weight room? And it's a certain isometric testing or certain positions testing from a force standpoint using the force plates of the weight room that we think would associate with some of like what we're seeing on the 1080 from like a top speed dominance or an early acceleration dominance. And then if we can connect that, maybe we could say, hey, there's a physical limitation here that we're seeing on the force plate. So maybe we can train and retest that over time. Or if not, maybe this is just a pure strategy input. So I'm probably missing a lot there, because that's definitely, there's definitely people who are far more knowledgeable than me in that. But I would say that piece of tech, I came in very naive to understanding the power of it, and leaving there now, it's something that I realize could be extremely powerful. And I'm hoping that trend continues in sports science, where not only the 1080, but we're getting tech that is, maybe it's some of the camera systems to monitor things that happen on the field or outside the field that are closer to the sport. And I think that's going to be really powerful, because if you actually think about it, like all these force plate testing and different things we like to do, like maybe from a neuromuscular quality standpoint, it could provide some information. For a lot of those guys in the NFL, they're very neuromuscularly gifted. They have a lot of like the physical gifts already. So it's so far away from the sport. Maybe the information it provides is a little outdated, but I still think that could be super powerful too.
Man, I've got so many questions in my head from what you've just laid out. That's fabulous. So first of all, did you have correlations between the 1080 splits, between the early accelerators and top speed further down the line, and force plates? Did you notice some kind of correlation between their performances?
Yeah, I would say most of it's anecdotal. Like to actually establish some of the correlations, we probably need significantly more data. But I would tell you, like, a lot of what we were seeing with knowing these guys and how they like to play made a lot of sense in regards to some of these like heavy, like max strength guys who possessed a lot of maximum strength ability in certain isometric tests on a force plate were really good accelerators, because we know that acceleration, there's these longer ground contact times, more time to produce force. Maybe they're not as springy, but they're able to power through the movement. And then some guys who are really fast, who are like really quick off the ground, we do certain force plate tests, like a drop jump test on a force plate, where we want to minimize ground contact and kind of evaluate more of a stretch shortening cycle ability, where they would spend very little time on the plate, but are able to get up really high still. And that seems to anecdotally do well with some of this max velocity sprinting, where we think about extremely low ground contact times where you have to produce force really quickly. And if you don't have like a foot ankle complex that has the ability to take that on and accept it, recoil that force really quickly, you're probably not going to be successful. So I would say anecdotally, it started to really make a lot of sense to us and to me personally as we started to collect more data.
I could totally see how that would filter the players into different areas of strength conditioning and athletic training, where, like you say, the foot ankle complex, if you notice something coming through there, I'm going to send them over to the AT and have them look at gait mechanics, lower leg especially. But for those guys that are the running backs, or the ones that are really creating top speed and force, if they're not showing that on the force plate, now I'm going to send them over and we're going to work on Olympic lifts, split squats, or whatever the case may be with the strength coach. I mean, that's some really amazing information that you can start to navigate these players just on the output that you're seeing with that data. Is that am I on the right track there?
Yeah, I would say that's definitely kind of it, is using this information to kind of provide a more specific training stimulus to these guys based on what they need. I mean, I think a lot of times we have to realize, like, especially in the NFL environment, you get such a little amount of time to actually train these guys because of the way the schedule is. You probably want to be as potent as possible with the stimulus. So you're probably gonna have to be pretty specific with a guy's weakness as early as you can. And even if it's just individualizing the program a little bit based on certain neuromuscular qualities or certain things that come up in that sprint, that we think are going to have like a larger return on investment for that person, because the time for them is really finite. Time's the ultimate resource. So we got to make sure we're, like I said earlier, we're pretty potent with that stimulus. So this is probably just a decent way to individualize those guys. And definitely want to say this is, I cannot take credit for any of this thinking. This was definitely established more by like Ryan Grubbs and Matt Van Dyke there, who just know significantly more about this than me. And most of like the framework they were able to put in place was amazing.
Well, you mentioned earlier too about the sprint guru coming on, and you thought you knew quite a bit, and then you're just blown
Yeah.
away. I'm wondering about those light bulb moments. There must have been, a chandelier's
Yeah.
worth of light bulb moments for you over the course of this time with the Texans. But what are the top? What are the things that just blew your brain and just said, "Oh my gosh, that's amazing. How did I not get there? Why didn't I think of that?"
Yeah. I mean, I think like we've talked about a lot of it, like a lot of stuff I was alluding to, where trying to connect some of the more specific weight room isometric or just different, even like some of the rate of force development testing you could do the weight room and connecting it to like strategies on the field or something we're seeing on those 1080 split times or change of direction tests. But I mean, I think just from being around Ryan, I had all these aha moments where he would then take that information and apply it in weight room training. So he would take on some guys individually and just seeing what he was able to do from like a weight room training standpoint, be very specific, and his stimulus, that was just a huge light bulb moment for me. And it made a lot of sense just understanding like the physics behind it and actual physiology.
Ah, right on. Okay. So it's such a wonderful thing, our field, our industry, that we have so many different branches that we can
Yeah.
follow down, right? We can be the strength and conditioning specialist, or we can go over to physical therapy or athletic training or into dietitian. But then we've got sports science. And you also alluded to this earlier with your affinity toward mathematics and economics, which of course is the language of mathematics itself.
Yeah.
But you've taken that language of math and brought it into the field of sports science. I guess, is that what gets you going? Is that what just lights the fire?
Yeah.
Is that?
Um, I think there's a few things that I find fascinating about sports science. I think it all stems from me finding performance and physiology extremely fascinating. And I think the thing about it that I find very interesting is the complexity of it, right? Like a human being, in regards to its physiology and its ability to perform, it's like a complex system. And there's like certain laws from complex systems that we know are going to occur in regards to different stimulus is not always causing the same effect based on the context. Like they call that a lot of time the butterfly effect. Um, so I found that really interesting, just how many variables there are in physiology and how many moving parts. And the fact that we can actually create a stimulus or try to create a specific stimulus to influence that physiology in a certain way or cause adaptation. And so I think when I was younger, I was naive thinking that we probably had a lot more control over what was going to happen than we actually do. And something that I've really thought about a lot as I've read some more of these data science books, and I've become very fascinated by human bias because I've realized there's a lot of bias in sports, is that we're collecting so much information now, but the human brain only has the ability to process a few information sources at the time and connect the dots. And a lot of times that's important because we can provide certain context around different scenarios that maybe a machine can't. But I think the beautiful thing that's happening with some of this machine learning or AI stuff that's being applied into sport is it's not going to have that cognitive bias that we're innately born with. It can take as many variables as you want into its algorithm, and it can try to find relationships between those different variables, and it can learn over time and understand how to weight those variables to answer a specific question. So I find that fascinating that like artificial intelligence, machine learning, good data science has this ability to take all of these sources of information and understand how they're related to each other, and then give you some kind of output in regards to a certain question you're going to ask. And I think it provides this competitive advantage over the human mind and just the ability to weigh all these different complex variables. And that's what physiology is. It's complex. So there's many different sources of information, especially now as we're collecting now. And I think it's going to take a combination of those machine learning innovations along with the human mind and some of the context we could provide to really get more and more specific and more potent with some of the things we're doing in the future.
Well, it sounds like that is the direction that you're taking with artificial intelligence and trying to marry it together with sports performance, and it's exciting. What do you hope to achieve? Based, you've just given a good presentation about it, but if you could take American football, for instance, and
Yeah.
applying AI to that, how could artificial intelligence help the NFL?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing the NFL, I think, is going down a lot of these rabbit holes, whether it's from like the concussion standpoint or hamstring injury risk standpoint. And I think obviously injury risk is very much a buzzword right now, and injury prediction is a very big buzzword, and people are very hyped up about that, probably because of the economic cost associated with injuries and the value of a win. Like every injury, however much monetary value you want to put on every single injury, how much the monetary value you want to put on it that it costs the team. And so it's a big problem that people think they can provide answers for. I'm definitely a little skeptical from that standpoint in regards to actual pure injury prediction, because I think injury in itself is very complex. But I think you could do some really interesting things from increased risk from an injury standpoint. And I think you're starting to see that become afloat with a lot of good work that's coming out. So we can collect different kinematic data to see how a person naturally runs. We can collect like MRI data, just like the natural structure of their hamstring or the architecture of their hamstring, the fascicle length, like the fascicle orientation, previous injuries, like what the tissue is looking like now. We can combine that with some workload monitoring, whether it's from GPS to see the amount of like high speed running, different sources of training. We can look at pure test of hamstring strength. And if we can take into account as many different risk factors, which we see in isolation maybe have some association, again, in isolation with, for example, hamstring risk in this situation, if we combine those all into a model, one would hope, and I think we're going to see that we have the ability to identify some individuals who are naturally at higher risk for this specific type of injury. And I also think that over time, it will be dynamic and show when they're at increased injury risk throughout the season or decreased. And I really think that model of like identifying specific injuries and sort of risk factors for each one is going to become more of the norm. And you're seeing that a lot with like different research coming out about injury prediction for like baseball pitchers in regards to their shoulder based on some like non-modifiable baseline data, but also some of the workload or data that is kind of modified throughout the season. And then I think I actually think there's a lot of relevance for not only an injury risk forecasting, but also just performance. I think you can take all these variables together and put it into some different groupings and understand different types of athletes. There's some really cool machine learning stuff that could cluster guys together and understand different similarities and differences they have. And maybe that will help us realize the ideal training stimuluses for these different types of athletes.
Okay, that's got me totally jazzed right now. I'm so excited. Usually, I gotta be honest, Jonah, like sports science, yes, there's some interesting things, but it's only because of my ignorance that
Yeah.
I really didn't fully comprehend the application that can be applied with not only AI, but the other things you've been mentioning this hour. So fascinating. I can totally see what gets you going with this. Now, within the NFL, there are networks of strength coaches.
Yep.
And there's the NFL Players Association. There's the athletic trainers that get together at the combine every year.
Yep.
Does the same hold true for sports scientists? Do you have colleagues amongst the 31 other teams that
Yeah.
you collaborate with?
I would definitely say that group is not as established or collected as these other subgroups, probably because sports scientists have been around in the NFL for a much less amount of time. But I got to know a lot of sports scientists just from them coming to us or going to them throughout the NFL. Met a lot of the different ones who I'm still connected with now and I'll talk to every now and then. But I would say that culture probably hasn't been established yet, but I'm hoping it will be. And because we mixed a lot with just the strength and conditioning coaches from other teams and other people in the performance department. So there definitely is a good culture of collaboration, but I'm hoping that it gets even better in the NFL.
And within teams and families for that matter, there's some individuals that really combine or have a strong connection with one another. Uh, is that the case with sports scientists with other professionals in the team? Like, did you guys really coordinate well with the
Yeah,
the trainer or the strength coach or
yeah,
the yeah, who did you connect with the best?
yeah. I think it's probably unique to each environment, and probably there's a lot of contextual information that's gonna influence who you become the closest with and have the best relationship with. So I could just speak from my personal experience. I've always had a very close relationship with the strength and conditioning department because they collect a lot of data now, the strength and conditioning department. So regards like a lot of times the force plates are within a weight room, the different hamstring testing is within a weight room, like velocity based training we had. And so obviously things like cameras that track bar speed are really common. And so they naturally have questions about this information, this data they're collecting. So it kind of opens the door to this natural relationship to providing some deeper insights. And then we had the same thing on the medical return to play side in regards to like them tracking GPS, different force plate testing when they're trying to get a guy back to his baseline. So I'd say those relationships from like a strength and conditioning, and then also the people who handle maybe some more end stage rehab, it's very natural for you to establish a good relationship and collaboration with those teams, in my personal experience.
And then what about the combine itself from an analytical perspective? The information that you glean from the combine, does that help, or do you feel now granted, you're young in your career but you've been surrounded by some pretty amazing gurus in the field of performance. Should the combine change? Should we be more concerned with other elements of athleticism, or are we just going to keep the same thing? Because truth be told, football coaches historically like doing the same thing over and over, and it
Yeah,
takes a lot to create change in their game plan. So I
yeah,
don't know. Thoughts on that?
yeah. No, yeah. I mean, I think that's like a natural human tendency. It's hard for us to change, and we like tradition, and yeah, that's probably rampant in all sports that I've noticed. But yeah, this is in my own personal bias or my own personal opinion, which is again, like you said, not a lot of experience. I probably would argue there probably are better tests you could do at the combine that again maybe correlate more to on-field performance. I say maybe there because I think as we talked about earlier, like on-field performance is extremely complex. Like you not only have all these physical elements about how fast you can run, change your direction, but obviously in this all sports there's a huge perceptual element, your ability to react to different stimuli, and you have guys who maybe don't have all those athletic qualities, but they're so potent or they're such great players because they really excel on this perceptual side. They can perceive the environment around them and they can react. And I think there's a lot of great literature coming out from like a motor control standpoint that's really showing it's really difficult to kind of separate these two different entities into own separate training stimuluses where a lot of times like you need that perceptual component to really get that motor control output, and it's really important like and can you train those things? It's probably really hard to train those things because it's really hard to test, and that kind of connects back to this question: can we actually test the most relevant things that are going to produce a good football player? I would say the tech maybe isn't there yet, because if you're talking about, hey, there's this huge perceptual element of all these things that happen in a football game, like you're a running back, you have to react to a defender, and how you perceive that is going to determine if you're a really good running back. And there's people who are doing like all this cognitive testing now, and I'm probably a little negative on those. I'm no like neurologist or psychologist, so I can't speak upon them too well. But in regards to like the literature I've seen about them, I don't know how well like a lot of these generalized cognition tests or generalized like reaction times tests are going to translate to on field performance. And I think the ability to react to certain perceptual things is very specific. And the only way to really test that is to watch game film and see how they do in different situations. And like I said, that's messy and hard to measure. And even the physical tests they do now at the combine, yeah, I'm not sure how well they actually correlate to on-field performance. So yeah, maybe there's different testing to do, but I would say my main answer is I don't know what the best testing would be, and I don't know if it's there yet, if we have the right test available.
Yeah, I just know that some Hall of Fame NFL players did not do very well at the
Yeah,
combine. Yet they got drafted somewhere in the under 200 choices and made it to
Yeah,
be some of the greatest of all time. So it just makes me kind of question: is the combine outdated? Do we need to kind of start to look at other elements? And
yeah,
like you say, there are other elements, but are they measurable? And do we have the
yeah,
tech or the ability to measure at this time? So maybe it's
yeah.
just a matter of time.
Exactly. No, and I think there's some new tech emergence emerging with like some linear positioning systems and different camera systems that I'm hoping I think they're gonna start testing at the combine in regards to actually getting like very high sampling frequency when someone runs a sprint or a change of direction test, and maybe you'll be able to get some better information about different phases of a sprint when they excel. But again, I do still think that's pretty far away from the actual stimulus of the sport.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting now. Other things that are emerging that you're kind of interested in? We've already talked about artificial intelligence, and I'm sure we can have an entire podcast all about the ins and outs of that.
Yeah.
But are there other things that you're looking at that you like, linear camera angles or anything else for that
Yeah.
matter?
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting. I think something that's really popping up now is like the measuring of kinematics. Like kinematics now is really becoming really trendy and probably for good reason. I think a lot of things that make kinematics difficult in the past is typically like you would have to wear markers to do like a biomechanical test, like so marker versus markerless based motion capture. And obviously on the field, it's not too realistic for someone to wear markers and go about practice and do all this testing. But I think you're starting to see some markerless solutions, and I've seen some markerless solutions on the market who I'm definitely skeptical towards, but I think the validation of them is getting better and better, and they're able to produce some really cool insights in regards to what they can do just from some high fidelity cameras and the different insights, or just the different information they can provide in regards to not only like kinematics, but then from that being able to predict some kind of forces encountered on the body. So I think a lot of it, I've heard some people say this before, and I definitely agree. Like the machine learning algorithms, the AI, I think that's kind of there right now in regards to it's really good, and I think we'll have the capability to do anything we need it to do. And I think the thing that's really going to push sports science forward is if we get better sources of information and better sources of physical information that actually correlates to performance, but maybe injury risk. And I think as like these camera systems improve, that could give you some markerless solutions, and they're able to sample at a higher frequency. I think that's going to be really powerful to feed into some of this AI. And then also just different wearable sensors are becoming smaller, and we've seen people wear accelerometers at different parts of their bodies, and some different, like now obviously there's like things like EMG shorts that again I'm not sure how accurate they are, but I think wearable technology is going to keep improving, and I think camera systems will keep improving, and I think that's going to become pretty interesting to see if we're provided with better information sources into these models, if they can do some provide some better outputs, because with better inputs you're going to get better outputs.
Well, it definitely is an interesting dichotomy, I guess I'd say, between trying to improve overall human performance to the nth degree, to that ultimate peak performance, while at the same time trying to mitigate or reduce the likelihood of injury. So you're
Yeah,
taking a body and creating just tremendous amounts of more powerful sheer force through
yeah,
acceleration, deceleration, change of direction, and still trying to keep those numbers down in the injury. Boy, that's a
yeah.
monumental task in itself.
Yeah, and I this may be my personal opinion, and not everyone may agree with this, but I think actually performance is synonymous with injury reduction. I think that there's much more established research in regards to physiological principles to improve performance and increase adaptation. And if you ask me, I think if you improve someone's physiology and improve someone's like ability to produce and accept force, that's going to naturally lead to less injury risk. So I think we've kind of created this craze about injury risk reduction strategies, and I actually think the best injury risk reduction strategy is just like a really good performance program, whether that's like a strength and conditioning standpoint or like the periodization of practice. So if you think about it, like you get someone's guy's ability to like handle really high levels of like eccentric forces, and their ability to brake and like a decelerate is really good. I would probably argue that you've raised the ceiling on that deceleration ability, and if you raise the ceiling on an event where injury is the likelihood of injuries are increased just because of the force profile, then you're probably going to reduce the risk of injury. That's probably a little too simple to go from A to B, but I would say that that's kind of how I think about it.
No, I love that. I love that because you're trying to create ultimate, I won't say brute force, but
Yeah,
ultimate explosivity, major maximal amount of power output, but in a way that you have to go through finesse to get there. It's
yeah,
not just about, can I shove this as far and as hard as possible, but can I do that in the most efficient way
yeah,
kinematically? Can my joints be in the proper position? Can the soft tissue
yeah,
respond in kind? Can the nervous system fire at the appropriate manner to give me
yeah,
that culmination of power, and not just simply just, in a hulking sort of way, just do it any way I can, because that is
yeah,
what's going to lead to a higher incident rate, because now we're talking about compensatory movements, wear and tear,
yeah,
inflammation, and then that whole pattern is repeated over and over subconsciously. I love that. I think you're spot on with
yeah. No, I definitely couldn't agree more with that. Raising someone's ability to perform is going to naturally probably reduce injury risk.
that. Yeah. Okay. So we're coming up to the end of the hour here. I can't
Yeah,
believe it. As always, when I get a really great guest on and we dive deep, the time flies by like you wouldn't believe. But so, Jonah, you're moving into the private sector, and maybe sometime down the road, when you really have yourself knee deep or up to your neck in private sector, we can come back and chat about what it's
yeah,
like infusing AI and sports science and so on. But if you were to kind of just somewhere down the road, several years or whatever, go, hey, you know what? I really liked my time in pro sports. I think I want to enter that arena again. Where would you like to go? I mean, we're talking about, you're in Brooklyn, Brooklyn Nets and all that, but is basketball where you'd like to head, or is there a different sport? Or is it the
yeah,
Olympics? All sports. What are we talking?
yeah. No, that's a great question. I definitely think I'm open to any possibility in the future. It's hard to know where you're going to be and the certain circumstances you're under. I have a lot of different interests, I would say. That's probably part of the reason why I'm pursuing all these different things right now. And like you just said, like the Olympics, like something that has been really fascinating for me recently is like individual sports. I've gone down a pretty deep rabbit hole now, I would say, in regards to like some of the endurance sports and the underlying physiology of those elite performers, in regards to like some of their O2 kinetics and their metabolic markers. And I find that stuff fascinating. And I think something that's so interesting in these individual sports as us as practitioners is you have total control over like the program, and you can measure all these different variables that you have control over, and there's less complexity of those individual sports. So with less complexity, you probably naturally have more influence. But at the same time, like I've loved my time in the NFL, and I think like the pure power speed of those athletes has been really fascinating, but also just like the variability of athletes. Like you get a 320-pound offensive lineman who can bench press 500 pounds and who maximum strength really matters. And then you get a wide receiver who can run 23 miles per hour, who's a totally different athlete, both in the same sport. And I kind of find that fascinating too, because of the novelty of the different athletes.
Oh, that's phenomenal. Yeah, yeah. You've got your own kind of Olympics within the
Yeah.
NFL with all the different positional requirements. Okay, Jonah, where can people get a little bit more insight, or if they want to follow your path?
Yeah.
Do you have an Instagram handle? What is it? How can we kind of follow you?
Yeah. I definitely am gonna try to get better on social media. When you're in the NFL, it's not a great environment from a time commitment to post a lot, or also just what you're doing. And I think social media could be a really cool thing now to share information and also acquire information. So I have a Twitter. Let me pull up my handle really quick. I would say I don't post a lot on Twitter. Mostly what I use Twitter for is to retweet papers I want to read. So if you go to my Twitter feed, it's a lot of random papers about like machine learning, but physiology and performance. And I've probably only read like 1/50th of them, so I have a long list. But so my Twitter handle is at JONI and then Sports Sci. So it's Joni Sports Sci is my Twitter handle. So JONI SPORTSCI. And then Instagram, I don't really post a lot, mostly just for personal use, but there it's Jonah and then underscore JAR, my initials, performance. So yeah, those are probably the two
Right.
best places to follow me. I'm hoping to post on those more. And yeah, anyone who ever wants to reach out, I would love to talk more.
Oh, right on. Well, I'd love to talk more too. So perhaps we can find a date later on and we can have you back on and chat a little bit more about sports science and everything you're doing. So thank you for coming on. This has
Yeah.
been great.
Y- Yeah, thank you for the time. I appreciate it again.
Well, that brings this episode of the Zelos podcast to a close. I want to thank Jonah for coming on, as well as the Texans organization for allowing us to share that insight and information. And, we've had somebody else from the Houston Texans on in the past. If you look in the archives, you'll find former President Jamie Roots on the show. And while you're at it, if you haven't clicked subscribe yet, tell 2 friends, click that subscribe button, and we'll see you next week.